We're in John chapter 6 today. John chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 15, and I want to get there very quickly. I want to remind us that we're in a series called Come and See. This refrain that we have read several times in the Gospel of John, an invitation for every person, the whole world is John's audience, to examine, to explore the identity of Jesus Christ on his own terms. Who is he? This is a question our world continues to ask. People are continuing to press in, to be curious about the person of Jesus. And it's important that the answer to that question, what we think about when we think about Jesus, is correct, because a lot hangs in the balance, both on his own claims about himself and the invitation that he gives to us. John writes at the end of the gospel, the summary statement for everything he's been doing. He says, these things are written so that you might believe. And by believing, you might have life in his name. Believe what? Well, it's become pretty clear if you've been tracking with us through this series that Jesus is no ordinary human. He's not just a great teacher. He didn't leave us to believe simply those things, which many people would believe about him. They're amazed at his teachings. He's a great philosopher. He was a great leader. Jesus is claiming to be the ultimate human. He's divine. And in this disclosure of himself to us, we see for the first time on the stage, and the only time on the stage of human history, a perfect human being. Now, one pastor says it's really hard for us to conceive of what the perfect human being would be because we ourselves are not perfect. We can't do that. And I wonder today if you had no context of Jesus, what are some of the categories you might come up with in your mind? And I think what the world would find is that Jesus Christ, the perfect human being, surprises us because often our ideas or ideals of, what a perfect human would look like are really more projections of what we ourselves desire or crave or want for ourselves. And Jesus breaks every category. Doesn't matter what culture you come from, doesn't matter what your politics or ideologies are. Jesus breaks every category, and he comes to every person, every human, and discloses the way to be human. So let's look at that together. And today we're going to look at one of his signs in the Gospel of John, these miracles that John points us to that reveal Jesus' identity. And the first thing we're going to see in this text is that there is, in all of our lives, the inevitable storm. The inevitable storm. And so John 6:15, look there with me now. John writes, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. This is just after Jesus had taken 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? 5 loaves and a couple of fish, and he had fed about 15 or 20,000 people. You've read this or maybe heard about this, no doubt, before. If you've heard about the life of Jesus, an amazing event where Jesus feeds the multitudes with nothing. And the people, right, they're on kind of the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee, and in this place called Tiberias. The people there are in a remote area, and when they see Jesus do this, they begin to believe that they say he's the prophet that's come into the world, the Messiah that Israel has been waiting for. Now, if you know anything about the first century, this time is a time that is absolutely pregnant with longing. It's full of longing. The people of God have not heard from a prophet for over 400 years. Malachi ends the revelation of God to his people in the Old Testament, and it's been centuries since they have heard anything from God, and they believe maybe more than any other point in history, in their history as a people, that the Messiah is about to come and they're looking for him. And when Jesus performs this miracle, he feeds all these people. They say, this is him. This is the prophet who we've read about, who we've been waiting for. And they want to make him king, but they want to make him a political king. Right? They want to make him the king that will upend their enemy, which is Rome. And Jesus is not a political king. His kingdom is not of this world. And so he knows what's going to happen, and he withdraws again to the mountain by himself. Verses 16 and 17, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. I find this fascinating because we know that Jesus sent them. He compelled them to go. That's what another account says. He compelled for his disciples to go. He said, you're going, you guys go on ahead without me. Several explanations as to why he might have done this. Maybe he did not want his kind of young in their faith, young in their formation as his disciples to get caught up in the political storm that was taking place where they were, right? If all of the crowds were saying, let's make him king, he didn't want his disciples to get that kind of a view of his kingdom. And so he said, you go, I'll withdraw myself, and he's working a plan. But nevertheless, what are you thinking if you're one of his disciples? You're here on this northeastern side of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus tells you to go back down here over to Capernaum. That's a long walk for Jesus. You're kind of wondering probably a couple things like, when are you going to join us? What are you going to do? We are not privy. We're not able to access that conversation, but it had to have been taking place. What is Jesus doing? Like, why would he send us on the boat? When's he going to come? If you know anything about a teacher, Jesus is a rabbi in Jewish culture, and their disciples always follow the rabbi. And so this has to seem strange to them that he's sending them across the sea. And verse 18 says this. And we know it's the middle of the night from other accounts. Verse 18 says, the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So let's just stop there for a minute and talk about this storm. The Sea of Galilee is about 680 feet below sea level. It's the lowest. It's called the Sea of Galilee, but it's a lake. As someone who's from Michigan, I like to say this a lot. Like, I get Jesus. He's a lake guy, okay? He's there. He likes the lake. He's on the lake. It's about 13 miles long, the Sea of Galilee. At its widest point, it's 8 miles wide, but it's almost 700 feet below sea level because it's in a valley. It's in a geographical formation called the Rift Valley, which we typically think of as it being in Africa, but it begins in Lebanon and goes all the way down as plates of the earth meet. They form a trench that goes from Lebanon all the way down through Kenya into Mozambique in Africa, and much of this is below sea level. The Dead Sea, which from the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River feeds into the Dead Sea, is 1,200 feet below sea level. And so because the Sea of Galilee is below sea level, some things happen in terms of the meteorological, that's a big word, the weather patterns that take place there. Where Jesus was, kind of near where he was at this point, is the Golan Heights. And the Golan Heights is about 4,000 feet above the lake. On the western side of the lake are the hills that are in Galilee. They're not as high, but if you imagine the sea being so low It's often warm, it's often humid, it's often hot on the sea. And in the higher elevations, the wind and the weather patterns are cooler and drier. And often on the Sea of Galilee, weather will come in over the hills and come down into the sea, down on the lake, and where the weather is warm and it meets where the cold air meets the warm air, quickly storms can arise kind of out of nowhere, and waves on the Sea of Galilee, waves on this large lake, it's not quite, it's wider than Lake Washington, but it's not as long as Lake Washington. So put that in your mind's eye. There can be 8-foot waves in a violent storm. That's huge. And the disciples are not in a powerboat, right? They're not in a cobalt. They're in a small, probably fishing vessel, and they're rowing across the lake, and a storm arises in the middle of the night. There's not light pollution from the nearby city. It's pitch dark, and there are very few places in the world that are more vulnerable than being on a large body of water in the middle of it in dark conditions when it starts to storm. And this is a picture, as Jesus is revealing himself, of something that every single person in this room, every single one of us joining online, faces regularly in life. So often, you go through life and everything seems kind of, hunky-dory. I know, nobody says that phrase anymore, but I do because I'm middle-aged, okay? Everything's going okay. Everything's fine. Everything's good. Everything's smooth. And then seemingly out of nowhere, a storm picks up. And what typically happens when the waters around us become turbulent? There are a lot of emotions that we feel, but the most common one is probably fear. I imagine that every single person here, every single person is dealing with a tremendous amount of anxiety, more than they would disclose, more than they would say. And how many of you, if you were honest, are feeling, sensing, carrying, even this morning, anxiety in your life about something? Steve Cuss is an author and a pastor, and he has written a book called Managing Leadership Anxiety, and our staff recently went through a training on leadership anxiety that was like a video series that he led. And he talks about the fact that anxiety exists in multiple spaces. So let's just identify some of those for a moment, and maybe you can identify where it impacts you. But he says, first, anxiety exists in the space inside of me. Second, he said, anxiety exists in the space between us, right? Between two people. Third, he says, anxiety exists in the space in the other. And then fourth, he talks about how anxiety exists in a group dynamic. It could be a church, that could be a city, that could be a nation, that could be a culture, that could be a family, it could be a lot of different things, but it can be in a group. So it's important for us to kind of differentiate those spaces because, yes, I know some of you are like, Ryan, I don't worry about things, I am really healthy and I don't feel anxiety, I don't sense anxiety. Great, good for you, congratulations. Pat yourself on the back. Really, please don't, because for the rest of us, anxiety is a pretty prevalent theme in our world. But even if you don't struggle with anxiety, there are people in your life that do. There are relationships that you have where anxiety exists. And he talks a lot about that third space where it exists in the other, and how when it exists in someone else, if you've noticed someone who is carrying anxiety, have you ever, if you're empathetic like me, sometimes I can feel people's emotions, and man, I don't know if you're like that, but when I feel your emotions, it's really hard for me to not try to hold them myself. But anxiety, when it exists in the other, it's the one place that we really can't do anything about it. I would love for you for just a moment to think in your mind about the places in your life that anxiety exists. And then if you've heard a Christian talk about anxiety before, I want you to take a deep breath, because I'm not going to tell you, what Bob Newhart in one of his episodes told a client who was struggling with fear, where he just said, "Stop it." I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to fix it for you. I'm not going to rationalize it, and I'm not going to over-spiritualize it for you, but I am going to speak the truth of Jesus' identity into your anxiety. So 3 things that we see in the rest of this text that Jesus is in our storm, in our fear. The first thing we see is that he's the Lord in the storm. Verse 19. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Now, just as it's still true in our culture in the first century, people were afraid of ghosts. They were afraid of spirits, phantoms, and these could have been evil spirits. They didn't always know what they were, but put yourself in the position of these disciples in the boat. You're in the boat, it's pitch black, the waves are going crazy, and then on top of it, right, you see a person, a presence walking toward you. You're 3 or 4 miles out. There isn't land anywhere close to you, and you know this, and you see someone just kind of strolling. I just love this image. Like, I feel like Jesus is so calm in this moment, and he's just like, "Hey guys, what's up?" You know how Esther talks when she leads our liturgy, where she's like, "All right, God really loves you." And it's very calming. I feel like that's Jesus walking in, and he's just completely chilled out. He's completely calm. And then they're like, "Ah!" That's what I would be like, what is happening to my life right now? And he strolls in, and they're frightened. And I just want to talk about this for a moment, but it's really important. Do you know that when fear and anxiety and when storms come in your life, often our tendency is to go on overdrive with trying to fix, with trying to manage, with trying to control, right? That's what anxiety does. It says, how can I control? And often when we're anxious and other people are anxious, the temperature begins to rise with our fear. Fear, anxiety, they're one of the most contagious feelings, emotions on planet Earth. And when it's happening, it's very difficult for us to think clearly. What does it mean that Jesus is the Lord in the storm? It means this, that if we would stop for a minute in the midst of the crazy of our lives, when things seem to be falling apart, I'm not telling you to do anything but this, but could we just stop and recognize that the most important thing we could do in anxiety is not to fix in fear, not to fix in chaos, not to manage it, but to stop and recognize that even in those situations, the Lord is present. I mean, what would it look like if instead of your brain ruminating again and again and again on what you're gonna do, or how you're gonna pay that bill, or what's gonna happen with your child, or what's gonna happen in your marriage, or what's gonna happen with your meeting with your boss, just to stop and invite the presence of God into that moment with you. But far too many times, we act like he doesn't even exist at all. Functionally, if we're Christians and we're honest, we don't live like we're Christians. We live like there is no God at all. And this moment is so important for the 12, and it's so important for us because it's a picture that when they are in those places, Jesus never says, I'm gonna take you out of all of those situations in your life. He never says, you know what, come to me and I will eradicate fear. Come to me and the world will never surprise you. Come to me and things will never blow up in your face. He says, come to me and I'll give you rest. Why? Because he's there. The second thing we see is that he's the Lord of the storm. He's the Lord of the storm. So you like this? Same phrase, okay? So you don't have to remember a lot today. If someone asks you what the sermon was about, remember Lord and storm, and then 3 prepositions. In, the second one is of. So they're freaking out, and Jesus says these words. It is I. Do not be afraid. Now, if you've read the Old Testament, you know that the Lord's most common command to his people is fear not. It's fear not. Fear not. Why? Because I am the Lord. And so again, we had this kind of language lesson last week. I want to have it again with you. If you weren't here last week, you're going to learn this. If you were here last week, they say reach and frequency. Repetition is helpful in learning. But the phrase, it is I, is very important. Because Jesus isn't just saying, I'm here. 2 words in Greek. They see him, they freak out. And what does he say to them? What's his response to them? He says, ego eimi. Not it is I. He just says, I am. I am. Now that's a weird way to talk about yourself, right? When I come up to people, I don't go, hey, what's your name? I am. Or when I show up at home after work and everybody's been kind of excited for me, well, the dogs are excited. Other people may be doing other things. The dogs are excited. I don't scream out, I am. No, this is the name that God disclosed to Moses to tell Moses who he was in Exodus chapter 3. God, if I go to your people in Egypt, who should I tell them sent me? And God says, I am that I am, Moses. And I am is kind of important to understand in the identity of Jesus, because it's not I was back there with you. I had a starting point. I began at one point. No, it's not I will be, because that's already implied in I am. It speaks to in the past, in the present, in the future, that Jesus doesn't have a starting point. He doesn't have an ending point. He's self-existent. He's not depending on you or myself to understand who he is or where he comes from. And this is really important. Some of us are here and we're like, somebody made you come. Your parents made you come, right? And you're like, okay, fine, Ryan. I'm at church. You're talking about Jesus. But I want you to think about this for a minute. This is a historical document. This happened if you were studying this in history and a historian was covering it accurately, you have to deal with this statement that a human in history, a person in history made, and they're saying, I am self-existent. Now, he's either wackadoo off his rocker, right? Crazy, or we have to contend with these words. And if he is self-existent, and if he does show up in the lives of his disciples, and if he does invite you and I in to be his disciples, then the same thing that he does for them, he can do for us. I am. This is one of 7 times in John's gospel that Jesus just says his name as I am. I want to look at some of the 7s in the Gospel of John just so you can get a flavor. 7, right? The Lord created the earth in 7 days. It's a number in the Bible of completion, of wholeness, of perfection. There are 7 I am statements in John's gospel. If we skipped ahead a couple of chapters, he's having a conversation with Pharisees, and they're talking about Abraham, and they're saying, we're Abraham's children. He's like, no, actually, you're not. And then he says to them at the end of this conversation, before Abraham was born, I am. And then they want to kill him because they know what he's doing. 7 of these statements that Jesus makes about himself, like he does here. He makes 7 I am the statements. So 7 I am with a predicate statement. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the vine. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. If you remember these statements of Jesus, I am statements about his identity. John's gospel, we're in the 5th of our 7 signs, these miracles that point to the person of Jesus and help us understand who he is. There are 7 forms of invitation in John's gospel to come and see. There are 7 witnesses in John's gospel to the identity of Jesus. You can keep going, but John is writing this gospel, and there are lots of clues. God's fingerprints are all over the gospel to help us because he doesn't want us to be clueless in our investigation of what he's doing and what he's saying. Jesus is the Lord of the storm. That means he is God over all. And so when you are in the middle of it, when you're in the middle of it, you don't have to be. So he's the Lord in the storm, he's the Lord of the storm, and then finally, he's the Lord through the storm. John 6:21. They were glad to take him into the boat. I bet they were. Whew. Okay. All right. And immediately, the boat was at the land to which they were going. Now, we don't know if this is another miracle or this is just John helping us to understand that as Jesus gets in the boat, the rest of the journey then is taken care of. But here's what we know. When the storm started and they didn't see Jesus, he was coming to them. In the middle of the storm, when they saw Jesus, he was in it with them. When Jesus greeted them with his identity, they knew he was the Lord of it. And here we see that he's the one who's going to go with them through it. And it is so hard to remember because sometimes these seasons of life, they last more than a hot minute. They feel like they're not going to end. We don't have all of the answers right away. And so here's what we need to know is that, Jesus, in the midst of your struggle, in the midst of your fear, in the midst of your freak out, is going to be with you through the process. So often we use the verse in Philippians chapter 4, don't be anxious about anything, but by prayer and supplications, present your requests to God, and then the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. So often we use that verse as a shut up, don't be anxious. And honestly, we abuse the text itself because the implication of the text isn't to say that you'll never feel fear again, that everything will be magically solved by prayer and that moment. What's Paul pointing us to? He's pointing us to the fact that we must live through a very dangerous world because of what sin has caused to it, a good but very broken world where there are threats to us, where there is real evil that wants to harm us, where there are things that don't work the way that they're supposed to. What he's saying is not that is like a pill that you swallow that fixes everything, but what he's saying is that is something that you constantly take on the daily to remind yourself that God's peace, even in the midst of that, can guard you. He doesn't say and the anxiety goes away, but there can be peace in the midst of the storm. And what's so imperative for us as we follow Christ is that we continually orient ourselves to his presence. What did I say in that first point? Anxiety may not go away right away, but it is an opportunity every time we face it to invite the presence of God into it. What would happen today? What would happen today if you just invited the presence of God into your situation? Some of us, I feel like, need to do that for the first time. Like you're here and you're not a Christian yet. You're processing all of this. And today there's Jesus he's kind of knocking. He's knocking and he's like, hey, let me in. Please let me in. I can be there with you. I can walk with you. I can love you. I can care for you. And I can be the Lord of the storm. But you have to see him for who he is if that's going to happen. So as a way for us to practice that today, we're going to come to the table and take communion together, this meal that Jesus instituted for his people to remind us of this reality, of this truth in our lives. And so the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, he took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and he said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then in the same way, also after supper, he took the cup and he said, this cup is a new covenant, a new relationship because of my blood. So do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat the bread, as often as you drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. And so we're going to do that together now. Communion is a reminder that Christ loves us so much and he wants to be present. He wants us to see how present he is, even in the worst storm that we go through. And so we'll come to the table now and we'll experience that together in community. And if it's your first time taking communion, I want you to know that this is something for those of us who are following Jesus. If you're not a Christian, it might not have as much meaning for you. It won't have as much meaning for you because it was intended for us as a remembrance meal as we follow Christ. So we'll have members of our team serving up front and in the balcony. And we'll come together now in community to take this. But let's pray before we do. Lord, how do we even begin to understand, to tap into the reality of your presence with us in this life? I mean, God, I myself so often have to just hit pause, and I realize that I'm really living out of Ryan's strength, which honestly makes me really tired. So God, may today be a time when you renew our strength, when you lift our eyes, and God, when you remind us of how deeply you love us. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.